We are delighted to be joined in this second session by Professor Susan Doran and by Professor Paulina Kewes herself. Please note that at 3 p.m. we plan to observe the national 1-minute silence in memory of His Royal Highness Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh. The event will pause at that point after Professor Kewes' paper, so that we can keep the silence for 1 minute, after which we will resume. Attendees and speakers are welcome to turn their cameras off during this. Now, to introduce our first speaker. Sue Doran is Professor of Early Modern British History and a Senior Research Fellow at Jesus and at St Benet's Hall. Her most recent book is Elizabeth I and Her Circle for Oxford University Press, and she is now in the process of finishing a book, Regime Change, from Elizabeth I to James I, 1603 to 1612, also for OUP. I will mention another collaborative project in which we are all engaged when I introduce our second speaker. Professor Doran is going to speak on the subject of A Jacobean Reformation, ? And a question which I now leave her to pose.
Hello, everybody. I hope you can see the overheads clearly. Peter, will you nod if all is going well?
All is going well.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry I can't see any of you today. This is very much second best. What I'm going to do today is rather different from what my colleagues did this morning. In the first place, Oxford University is only going to be mentioned in dispatches. My focus is very much on the national picture. And the second is that I'm moving from the 16th century to the reign of James I. But in doing so, I hope you get a sense of the legacy of Elizabeth I, our founder of Jesus College. Now, the question mark in the title arises because historians today tend to see and talk about the reign of James I as a post-Reformation period. Now, of course, I recognize that there was no change in direction in 1603, no major modification of the 1559 religious settlement. But I do see the Jacobean period, and indeed Charles I's reign, as part of what used to be called, and I think still should be called, the Long Reformation. To my mind, we are still in the midst of the Reformation in the early 17th century for a number of reasons. First, contemporaries, both Protestants and Catholics, did not see the Reformation as over. Although their expectations for change were to come to nothing, the struggles for change continued. The king remained under pressure from all sides, conformists, Puritans and Catholics and those in between and overlapping for much of the reign, in much the same way as Elizabeth had. Third, the conversion process was not over. Preachers did not give up their attempt to bring Catholics in England, Wales and Ireland into the true church. The Catholic missions themselves gathered force. More priests were coming over from the continent and more lay Catholics were being educated abroad. There was actually seen to be a greater conversion process in this early period of the 17th century. But at the same time, it was not, in Elizabeth's words, semper eadem for the established church. Bishops undertook reforms of the clergy, a new English Bible was published, local communities began to refurbish their churches, in all cases as an aid to edification, and in some cases to express the beauty of holiness, a more avant-garde view that was gaining some traction in the early 17th century. And finally, debates and divisions were emerging within the ecclesiastical hierarchy over some key theological doctrines, notably predestinarianism and also the role of the sacraments. Now, I clearly do not have time in the 30 minutes allotted to me to cover all this ground. And so what I'm going to do, and I hope I have time for both these things, is to talk about first the lobbying for religious change under James, and secondly, to look at some of the Jacobean reforms. Next slide. Sorry, my slides are not working, Peter. Yes, they are. I've combated technology. Okay, so in the slide, you can see that the heading is Puritan petitions. I'm not sure if you're aware, but in the later part of this 16th century, from the 1560s onwards, there was the growth of a movement that we called the Puritan movement, a godly movement, which was trying to push the Elizabethan regime into changes to the prayer book and into reforms. Now, some of the bishops of Elizabeth wanted this as well, but Elizabeth herself stayed firm against any kind of change, semper eadem. And by the end of the reign, she and her new archbishop, Whitgift, John Whitgift, really tried to hammer the Puritans and keep them quiet, and indeed hound some of them out of the church. It looked in the last years of Elizabeth's reign as if they'd been successful, but this was illusory. And at the beginning of James's reign, there was a movement of these Puritans, some of whom were Presbyterians, others who just wanted more moderate reform, to petition James to bring about a new, bring about major reforms in the church. The man you can see on the left is Arthur Hildesham, who was a leading Puritan minister in Leicestershire, and he was one of the authors of this coordinated, widespread Puritan campaign. The most well-known petition, by no means the only petition, was the Millenary Petition of 1603. And here we can see some of the tactics that all the petitioners used. The first is they presented themselves as loyal and moderate. You can see that in the wording that I've put there. But the second is that they tried to disengage themselves from Presbyterianism. So there was no demand in their long list of not so much demands, but requests, because they were moderate. There was none that called for the abolition of the episcopacy, the linchpin of Presbyterian reform. Instead of that, they were calling for changes in worship. So, for example, and very importantly, there should be no cross at the time of baptism on the child, and that ministers, as everybody would agree, should be good preachers. And everybody would agree that church livings should be held by only one minister, and there should be a cease to pluralism, and non-residents should no longer exist. And finally, and more controversially, there was a request for church discipline to be carried out by the pastors of the church and not by the Court of High Commission, and that it should be one that was designed to not to excommunicate for trifling matters, but rather to have gentle talks, a bit like tutors do in their collections when they're trying to upbraid, but not too heavily discipline students. Now, at the same time as the Puritans were looking for reform, so were the Catholics. They, of course, would have ideally wanted the total dismantling of the 1559 prayer book. But if that was not possible, what they were calling for was the removal or the moderation of all the penal reforms, that statutes that had gone through Parliament, which meant they were fined when they didn't attend church, and which meant they couldn't sit as MPs, and there were other restrictions, severe restrictions, and financial burdens on them. One of the leaders of these petitions was the man on your left, Sir Thomas Tresham. He was a gentleman who was a loyalist, but at the same time frequently fell into recusancy, i.e. non-attendance at church. Now, they drew up petitions just like the Puritans, which were handed to James in 1603, But as you can see here, some of them went into print, and there are 3 of them that appeared in 1603, but this was to continue over the following year as well. So why did the Puritans think that James would be sympathetic to their demands? After all, James was well known for having had conflicts and clashes with the Scottish Kirk while he was King of Scotland. There were a number of reasons. First of all, although James clearly disliked Presbyterians, he had allowed some English Puritans to take refuge in Scotland when they got into trouble with Elizabeth I and John Whitgift. And notable amongst them was his own royal printer, Wardegrave. But he also had friends around him, and I've named 3 of them here, one of whom was Scottish, Patrick Galloway, and the other 2 were English, but all 3 of these were noted Puritans. I just want to mention James Montague, because he was someone who, although a Puritan, based in Cambridge University, became Dean of the Chapel Royal. And he was a good friend of James and became a bishop. So it was a way that a moderate Puritan could be retained within the church, whilst at the same time being sympathetic for further reforms. Now, to try and get the Puritans to stay on board, but James, when he came to the throne of England, it wasn't seen as a done deal. It wasn't seen as something settled. There were immediately whispers that there were 2 other people who might instead be raising armies to challenge James's right to the throne. And James needed really a broad base of support. We'll see too that there were also some Catholic conspiracies when he first came to the throne. So not only has he got to bring on board all Protestants of whatever kind of hue, whether they're conformist or whether they are Puritan, he also had to keep on board the Catholics. To keep on board the Protestants, and also to present himself as a physician who was going to heal the abuses in the English church, James agreed to call a conference. It's very well known. It's the Hampton Court Conference that took place over the period of 4 days in January 1604. It couldn't take place earlier because England was ravaged. Certainly the southern part and parts of the north were ravaged by plague when James took the throne. The spokesperson for the Puritans at this conference, who were trying to present a case that there needed to be reforms in the church, was John Reynolds. This is my first mention of someone from Oxford. He was president of Corpus Christi between 1598 and 1607, and he was the leader of the Puritans at Oxford University. And there was a solid group of Puritans based in the University of Oxford, just as there was at the University of Cambridge. Speaking for the bishops was not Whitgift, but his sidekick, Richard Bancroft, Bishop of London, who had a very strong reputation as being someone hostile to the Puritans, but also of being an excellent scholar and polemicist. Now, James was meant to be the moderator. He was supposed to sit back and do a chairman's job, rather like Hamish did this morning and Peter is to do this afternoon. But he didn't. He engaged fully in the debate. Occasionally, he supported the Puritans, but more usually, he supported the bishops. He supported the bishops in 2 major ways. The first was that he claimed that the prayer book that he presumably knew very well, the English prayer book, was based on scripture. And it was only in very small matters that it needed some kind of modification. Of course, that was very different from the position that the Puritans were taking. And the second way that he supported the bishops was that he was at a couple of points in the conference identifying the moderate Puritans with Presbyterians. And it was during the conference that he made the phrase, which is, you know, best associated with King James, which was no bishop, no king. And that came out during a debate on whether there should be confirmation by bishops after baptism. And John Reynolds said this was unscriptural. Bancroft said this is important for the bishops, and James did not want any undermining of the bishop's authority in the matter of confirmation. So James at Hampton Court became a very strong supporter of the prayer book. And indeed, he supported and authorized, and it wasn't authorized by statute, unlike the 1559 prayer book, but by proclamation and going through convocation, a new prayer book in 1604. Now, I say it's a new prayer book, but actually there was very little that was new in it. And some of the major criticisms of the old prayer book were not dealt with, they were retained in the new one. Most obviously, the cross in baptism, the ring in marriage, kneeling at communion as part of the rubric. These were all retained within the new prayer book. And even the small things that were modified were not to the extent that the Puritans wanted. So, for example, it was a demand of the Puritans that there should not be lay baptism of babies and infants. This was in part, if not largely, because they didn't want baptism to seem as if it was a work that without which a baby could not be saved. It seemed to go in the face of justification by faith alone and predestinarianism, which was the theology that was embedded in the English church and certainly was crucial to Puritan thinking. Now, while the prayer book, the new prayer book rubric, did remove lay baptism, did say that in future they should not be lay baptism, it did say that in emergencies, ministers should be found who would baptize the child if it looked as if that child would otherwise die without being baptized. And that remained anathema to Puritans. Now, the prayer book was authorized and extended, the rubrics in the prayer book, by the canons of 1604. The canons went through a convocation at the same time as a parliament was held in 1604, but again, they were never authorized by parliament, parliamentary statute, only by letters patent of the king exercising his royal authority. And the canons elaborated and extended the ceremonies that the Puritans found objectionable. So let's turn to the Catholics. Why did they think James was going to be sympathetic to their cause? Well, of course, his mother was a Catholic, and it was believed, and certainly one of the first things James did when he came down to England was to ensure that in Peterborough there was a new setting for his mother's tomb, so that she was under a cloth of estate that showed that she was a queen. It was showing honor and dignity and respect to his mother. Secondly, there were Catholics who took the oath of supremacy, but who nonetheless were known not to be Protestant in either their belief or their practice, except on occasion. These Catholics, we call crypto-Catholics, some of them were present in the council in the court. The most notable one was Henry Howard, who had been an outsider under Elizabeth, but became the Earl of Northampton. But he wasn't the only one. And so there was a sense that James was listening to Catholics just as the Puritans thought he was listening to Puritans. This is James's genius. He seems to appeal to both sides, and neither side appreciates quite just how, in some ways, duplicitous he is being. At the same time, James had close friendships with Scottish Catholics when he was in Scotland, notably the Earl of Huntly. But perhaps most important, when James was looking to become King of England, he tried to get on board the Pope and the King of Spain. He was alarmed that an alternative candidate would be put forward, who would be the Infanta of Spain, or would be perhaps one of the Catholics in the Tudor royal family, one of those who was a cousin of Lady Jane Grey, and that he himself would not be able to get a foothold and get his claim and right and title to the throne of England accepted abroad. And so he did try and court them, and also let them think perhaps he might in the future become a Catholic, but in the meantime would be prepared to be tolerant of them. This did not last long, and it didn't for either the Puritans or for the Catholics. In this picture, on this slide, on the left-hand side, you can see, but you can't read, one of the documents that gave information to the Privy Council in 1604 of just how they were rounding up Catholics and how they were fining them. The numbers were pretty strong. I can't find it offhand in my notes, but we're talking about hundreds of Catholics who, in a new wave in 1604, were finding themselves paying recusancy fines, which had been suspended briefly at the beginning of James's reign, and which were now resumed. We find, looking at the other part on the right-hand side of that slide, we find there are three examples of what we would call today persecutions. Now, unquestionably, under James, the numbers of priests and lay people executed was minimal compared to Elizabeth. The estimated numbers of the Catholic Church are that there were 25 men who endured this fate from 1604 to 1618, whereas there are 189 under Elizabeth after 1870. So we're talking about significant difference. But we have to remember the times were different. First of all, James had not been excommunicated by the Pope. And secondly, there was no war on. So the Catholics were not seen as a fifth column. And thirdly, James needed to keep the peace with both France and Spain. He made peace with Spain in 1604, and he was very concerned that that peace should in no way be shattered. And what you have here are three examples, all of which with Oxford connections, which is why I chose them. But more importantly, because they also give an illustration of when and the context of these executions. The first one was in that wave in 1604, summer of 1604, when there's a new drive against Catholics. The man being tortured on the at the bottom left is someone called Nicholas Owen, who was born in Oxford, and he was executed in the wake of the Gunpowder Plot of 1605. He was someone who was held responsible for, quite rightly, for building priest holes in houses. He was with the Jesuit Henry Garnet when Garnet was wrongly being captured for being part of the plot. Not wrongly being captured, but wrongly being thought of as part of the plot. and he died. He wasn't executed, he died in prison. And the third one is George Napier, and that plaque is on Oxford Castle. And what he was found guilty of is a refusal to take the oath of allegiance that was established, first of all, in 1606, after the Gunpowder Plot, where anyone who was a recusant or a priest had to swear, not just that they owed allegiance to the king, but that any attempt by the Pope to depose a monarch, any claim of the Pope to depose a monarch, was in fact heretical. So it was a denial of papal supremacy in that particular respect. And unsurprisingly, a large number of Catholics would not take the oath, and many of them were executed. At least 17 were executed, and George Napier was one of them at that time. He was executed in 1610, and that was another wave of actions against Catholics, because Henry IV in that year was assassinated by a Jesuit. And so again, there was this sense of Catholics trying to overturn the government. Now, one of the new reforms, which I cannot deal with I can see time is fast running out. I cannot deal at any length with, but there's a new 1611 Bible. There were many Bibles in England before this Bible, but the two most well-known ones was the Geneva Bible, which was a quarto edition, very well laid out, and consequently very popular with virtually all Protestants, and it had marginal notes which were for discussion. The other Bible was the Bishop's Bible, which was made a folio Bible and was largely used in churches. Now, the Puritans wanted a new Bible. They called for a new Bible at Hampton Court, but they wanted it based on the Geneva Bible. James was prepared to have a new Bible, but he wanted it based on the Bishop's Bible. The Oxford group were to be new translators of the Bible, but there were also scholars from Cambridge and also from London. Here we have how James is concerned that the new Bible would be based on the Bishop's Bible. And here we see what he did. He gave the Bishop's Bible to these scholars, and they were told to make corrections. And you can see the model Bible with the corrections produced by some of the translators, so that there would be a better translated Bible. The Bible that appeared fitted with what James wanted, in that there were no marginal notes, in that there were no references to tyranny and tyrants in the new Bible. And you can also see too that this new Bible, although we call it the Authorized Bible and the King James's Bible, did not have that title at the time. The closest we get to King James in the frontispiece to the Bible is the prominence of St. Andrew amongst the apostles at the top of the frontispiece. I now move on very quickly to the preaching clergy. We can see from the numbers here that a great start had been made under Elizabeth. I think that was mentioned by Felicity, but it continues. The dynamic goes on, and it's supported by James and it's supported by the bishops, so that you get, by the end of James's reign, and certainly by the end of Charles's reign, a move to an all graduate clergy, not just in London, but in most parts, most dioceses in England. And my final slides, I want you to see them because I think they're the most beautiful of all. What you also get under James is refurbishment of parish churches. They had been left to fall into some decay under Elizabeth. And many parishes wanted to show a pride in their church, just as they had in the pre-Reformation period. But they wanted to transform the interiors of the churches from places which were for ceremonial purposes, for the sacraments, into places, into spaces for preaching. And so you can see here the great emphasis in the interiors of churches on new pulpits. In all of these, you can see that these were pulpits for preaching, for reading the Gospels, and also for giving lectures. And furthermore, you can also see in this particular one, the royal supremacy being central on the rood screen, which survived without any saints, in the place where the rood, the crucifixion of Christ, with his mother and St. James on the other side, would have been in the pre-Reformation church. And in this particular slide, you can see another development within the interior of churches, which is box pews. If people are going to listen to long sermons, they need to be comfortable. And in addition to that, the gentry need to show themselves as being somewhat separate from the riffraff as they saw it in the rest of the church. What's interesting about this particular box pew is that it was actually made from an old rood screen of the pre-Reformation period. And in this particular part of the slide, you can see the importance of the word, not just the word in preaching, but also the word visually, literally. And so it was placed over this rood screen again, instead of the crucifix, which would have been there in the pre-Reformation church. So my conclusion, very quickly. Under James, the struggle for changes to the 1559 church settlement continued unabated. James, like Elizabeth, had to grapple with the contentious Reformation question of how far the monarch had the right and power to control religious beliefs and behavior. In his answer, there was a paper-thin difference from that of his predecessor. Although Elizabeth's death led both Puritans and Catholics to hope, and in some cases believe that changes were afoot, it was illusory. James, like Elizabeth, understood the royal supremacy to mean that monarchs had the right to impose uniformity of religious practice on their subjects. The Jacobean Church, moreover, was no more harmonious than the Elizabethan Church had been, perhaps even less so, given the outspokenness later in the reign of those who start rejecting Calvinist predestinarianism, and also those who wanted to restore the sacrament. And so you're going to see that Charles I inherits an unstable church. It's like an old car. It needed to be driven very carefully. Charles I didn't know how to drive carefully. You get the Civil War. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sue. That was wonderful, not least the glorious closing image. May I turn to introduce our other speaker, my friend Paulina Kewes, who is Professor of English Literature and Fellow of Jesus College. She has been awarded a Leverhulme Trust Major Research Fellowship in 2021 to 24 for her research project, Contesting the Royal Succession in Reformation England, Latimer to Shakespeare. She has also been awarded a John Fell Grant for an international interdisciplinary project, Recovering Europe's Parliamentary Culture, 1500 to 1700. She is collaborating with Sue on the Museum of Oxford exhibition, Oxford Reformed, and with Sue and me on a book on the same subject. She is also the convener of the Jesus College Alumni Events series entitled Celebrating the Elizabethan College, of which today's session is a part. Now she's going to speak on the subject of monuments and memorials of the Reformation in Oxford. Paulina.
Thank you so much, Peter. Is my screen sharing working?
Yes.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for having me. It's a great pleasure. This is something of a new departure for me. I don't normally work on the 19th and 20th centuries, but Sue, William White, and I are collaborating on an exhibition about which we hope to tell you more in the future. And of course, Peter, Sue, and I will be working on a book on this subject. Monuments and memorials of the Reformation. What do we understand by monuments and memorials? And which Reformation do we mean? If you look at this image, you see the cross where Latimer and Ridley were supposed to have been burnt outside Balliol on Broad Street. We see Elizabeth, who we heard about as spearheading the Reformation, but who for Catholics was the Jezebel. We see the Martyrs Memorial, which many today pass by in St. Giles without realizing when it was erected or why. We also see the bust of Henry Newman tucked away in Trinity College, Oxford, when there was an attempt to put up a memorial to Newman on Broad Street. There was such an outcry against it that the statue was actually put up in London at the Brompton Oratory. And we also see the image of Charles I, the royal martyr. What was he the martyr to? What did he die for? Who would actually consider him as a martyr? Did he die for religion? And below we see an image from the oratory of Saint Aloysius, which depicts Edmund Campion, that we have the man we've heard about, the Jesuit who escapes from Oxford and then comes back on a mission, positioned next to Elizabeth. And the clear sense is that Campion is a saint. He has been sainted by the Pope, whereas Elizabeth is again the wicked one. So how do we make sense of the ways in which the very physical cityscape, the physical fabric of Oxford has been transformed as a result of the various reformations? Now, the major stimulus for this physical material transformation was the Catholic Emancipation Act of 1829, and you have an extract here from it. The key point to remember is that Catholics had no civil rights in England until that time. They couldn't hold office, they couldn't study at universities of Oxford or Cambridge. That act changed it. But it didn't change it because suddenly the English Parliament saw the light and decided that they were all extremely tolerationist. It changed because of a very complex situation in Ireland. I won't go into the details of that, but let's remember that Catholic Reformation, Catholic Emancipation comes in the 1820s as a result of complex political developments rather than as a great change in worldview. And also that there is very, very strong opposition against it. And there are various demonstrations which we could describe as anti-Catholic or as anti-Popish. But after 1829, Catholics can stand for Parliament, as can by now Protestant dissenters who had been excluded from civil rights by other acts, the Tax and Corporation Act, which had in turn been revoked in 1828. And now we get to Oxford. At that time, Oxford had representation in Parliament. At one point, Robert Peel was an MP for Oxford. And around the same time as Parliament moves to abolish Catholic disadvantages to allow them to hold office, we find what has been described in the historiography sometimes as the Second Reformation. Well, given that we've heard that there were so many reformations in the early modern period, including the Long Reformation, perhaps the numbering doesn't quite work. But the point is that a group of fellows, mostly drawn from Oriel College, including John Henry Newman, gave rise to the so-called Oxford movement or Tractarian movement. It was a movement that sought to recover the Catholic roots of the English Church. It was drawn to greater ceremony and ritualism, and several of those involved in that movement had a very ambivalent and ambiguous view of the Reformation. They would say that they hated the Reformation, and they had a very questionable attitude towards those whom we heard from other speakers today. The generality had considered as the heroes of the Reformation, such as, for example, Ridley and Latimer and Cranmer. The tension that resulted in Oxford and in the wider Britain meant that there were attempts to commemorate the heroes of the Reformation in a way that would be both anti-Catholic and anti-Tractarian or anti-Oxford movement. So we go back to Cranmer, Latimer, and Ridley. The Oxford Martyrs, monumentalized in Fox's Book of Martyrs, who had paid with their lives for their beliefs. Let's remember that Cranmer, in fact, recanted and then recanted his recantation. And some dons connected with the Tractarian movement and connected with the Anglican Church, but fearful that the Tractarian movement was getting too close for comfort to Roman Catholicism, began a campaign for an appropriate monument to be erected in Oxford, monument to the martyrs of the Protestant Reformation. And here you see an old postcard of that memorial, which was finally erected in 1843. Now, this was a very protracted process. We start in 1838 with the initial proposals, and at first the idea was not just to have a memorial, but actually to have a new church. And those behind the proposal, among whom Charles Golightly was the most important one, first of all tried to involve the Tractarians in the proposal. Originally, Newman was actually on board, as was Pusey. And the idea was not to make it offensive to anyone, but as the proposal developed and as meetings were being held, the anti-Catholic wing of those involved prevailed. And the upshot was that the inscription, which went through several drafts, not only commemorated the martyrs, but also, as you can see here, included a very powerful anti-Catholic message against the errors of the Church of Rome. In other words, in 1843, when we might expect greater openness, in fact, what we find is a memorial which is aimed at a large constituency of the British who had only recently gained their civil rights. And inevitably, the erection of the monument garnered quite a lot of opposition from some of the Anglo-Catholics, such as Newman, but also from Catholics proper. And here you will see, for instance, an extract from a letter from Newman from 39, that is to say, before the monument actually appears. He says, "It is most preposterous to be called on to join so ramshackle, tumble down a concern, got up by one or two men and begun in spite against myself and others." And he was also, Newman was also gloating because the campaign to have a new church built foundered because not enough money was collected. So in the event, we only have the memorial and a new wing of the Church of St. Mary Magdalene. On the right-hand side, we have an even more vociferous letter opposing the Martyrs Memorial from Petition, who is taken as the greatest exponent of the so-called Gothic revival. And of course, the Oxford Memorial is created in that newly ascendant style, which is modeled on 14th, 15th century Gothic. And it contains as a motif the Eleanor crosses. And the author of the architect of the memorial was Gilbert Scott, who modestly admitted that he thought his monument was as good as he could make it, and only Petition would have built a better one. Now, Petition, again, before the unveiling of the monument, produces a letter on the proposed Protestant memorial, and he says, "You must acknowledge Cranmer and his colleagues to be vile, blasphemous impostors, pretending inspiration while setting forth false doctrines." Petition, you will remember, was behind the newly the Houses of Parliament, which are being restored. He also appended to his pamphlet a little sarcastic advertisement where he was saying, well, the legend has it that Cranmer's heart survived the flames. Well, anyone who is in possession of it perhaps could repair to me, and that heart could then be placed in the shrine to this new Protestant saint. So you can imagine that tempers ran extremely high. And something that again connects the process very much to Oxford and specifically to Oriel College is that one of the people who was very much opposed to the Tractarians was suggesting already in the 1830s that the ban on the admission of anyone who is not willing to subscribe to the 39 articles at their matriculation, that despite that ban, Protestant nonconformists should be admitted to Oxford and to Cambridge, but of course he primarily meant Oxford. In the event, it was only in 1854 that that oath required at matriculation was rescinded. You can see it here, Oxford University Act of 1854. And from that point on, anyone who is not Church of England could come to study at Oxford only for an undergraduate degree. That act was supplemented by the Universities Tests Act of 1871, which removed any bans on non-Protestants studying for higher degrees and also for non-Protestants holding positions within the university. This is something crucially important. Think about it. Only 150 years ago was it made possible for non-believers, for non-conformists, for Jews to study for further degrees or indeed to hold positions at Oxford colleges and at the university itself. And those acts produced an explosion of buildings at Oxford. You can see Keble College named after one of the Tractarians and embodied the sort of fully fledged Gothic revivalist style. You see Pusey House named after another of the Tractarians. You see St. Benet's Hall, which is a Benedictine hall, and St. Aloysius Church, which was the second Catholic church to be erected at Oxford. Interestingly, both St. Aloysius and St. Ignatius Chapel, which was located near St. Clement's, both of them were rather set off away from the street for fear of anti-Catholic mobs intervening. At each point of some progress in the emancipation of Catholics and the opening up, for instance, of educational institutions, there were always throwbacks and there were also anti-Catholic reactions. We found them in 1850-51 following the Pope's recreation of the Catholic hierarchy of bishops and the Archbishop. This is when we have Archbishop of Westminster, and one of the holders of that position became William Manning, another of the converts to Catholicism alongside Newman. But worse was to come in 1870, when the next Pope held the so-called First Vatican Congress, and one of the resolutions was that the Pope was infallible. This caused William Gladstone, who was Prime Minister for much of the time we're talking about, to produce pamphlets which curiously hark back to some of those written by Protestants in the reign of Elizabeth I, accusing Catholics of being traitors and questioning their allegiance to the British Crown, to Queen Victoria. And you can see here a Punch cartoon where the Gladstone is shown separating those black sheep members of the Church of England and suggesting that they should just get the hell out of the church and go to Rome, as so many Tractarians in fact did. And his pamphlets questioning the allegiance of Catholics were in turn answered by both Newman and Manning. And Manning in particular, this is so curious, Manning, who had been very much a Church of England man, and who within months of the unveiling of the Martyrs Monument preached a sermon on the gunpowder plot, and who expostulated against the papal excommunication of Elizabeth, by 1875 is actually criticizing Gladstone for making some of the same points. Now, let me fast forward to the early 20th century. So by now, the Catholics and Protestants of a nonconformist color had been able to study at Oxford for some time, even though for the Catholics it wasn't a very easy journey, because although they were now legitimately able to come and matriculate after 1871, the Pope and the newly established English Catholic hierarchy said that it would probably not be a good idea for them to come. So they were in fact banned from coming, this time not by the Protestant state and the church, but by their own co-religionists, on the ground not so much that they would be seduced into Protestantism, but that the Oxford of the time was so open to rationalism that they might lose any kind of faith altogether. Now, you will all remember the campaign for Rhodes Must Fall last spring. And it was during that campaign that I realized some effect, actually, which is very well known to the Oxford Catholic community, that next to Rhodes, on the facade of the Rhodes building, which was opened in 1911, we find Cardinal William Allen, one of the greatest enemies of Elizabeth, who, an Oxford man, again, he was in charge, he was principal of St. Mary Hall, which was a little hall associated with Oriel College. In his pamphlet of 1588, the year of the Armada, was supposed to have been distributed in England after the successful Spanish conquest, and in it he called Elizabeth a Jezebel and suggested that she had multiple bastards and that she was really a woman of no religion. So imagine the Oriel College front in 1911 sporting a statue of basically the enemy of everything that the Protestant state under Elizabeth had stood for. And Allen, as someone who originated in Oriel, was seen by his biographer of 1908 as a forerunner of Cardinal Newman. The argument of that biography was that, in fact, Newman's example, his conversion, would lead all of England to embrace the Catholic religion. Now, let's look at some more recent examples. This is something that I would really like to emphasize in the closing minutes of my talk. Those conflicts which originated at the time of the Reformation haven't completely died down. And there are attempts by both Protestants and Catholics and Anglo-Catholics to commemorate those they see as the heroes of their tradition. And there are competing interpretations of the Reformation and its significance. You have already seen that plaque from Holywell Street, which is to the Catholic Martyrs. Very emphatically, here those Catholics executed under Elizabeth are presented as martyrs, not as traitors. Of course, they are seen as martyrs by the Catholic Church. Then you see the Prayer Book Society celebrating the Martyr's Cross outside Balliol, and there are also occasionally such celebrations outside the Martyr's Memorial. But curiously, St. Mary Magdalene's is now home to revived Anglo-Catholicism, so very much in tension with what it was supposed to have been when both the new wing of the church and the Martyrs Memorial were unveiled. And finally, we see the latest, and this one, an ecumenical Martyrs Memorial, which was erected in St. Mary's University Church as recently as 2008. And you will see here that Edmund Campion and Ridley and Cranmer and Napier are named in one breath. You can imagine that some of these men are in fact turning in their graves, seeing themselves listed on that Martyrs Memorial alongside their mortal enemies. Why was that memorial erected? It was spearheaded by Dermot MacCulloch, formerly professor of theology at Oxford, one of the greatest, if not the greatest, historians of the Reformation, who is now a fellow of both St. Cross and Campion Hall, and Sir Hugo Brunner, Lord Lieutenant of Oxfordshire. And it might seem as merely an ecumenical gesture. Let's all now get along and let's put everyone who suffered in Oxford for their faith, whether Protestant or Catholic, together. But there is an interesting story behind this enterprise, and that is that Hugo Bonner's wife comes from a Catholic family, starting with John Hungerford Pollen, who was a Tractarian converted to Catholicism, and one of his fourth son, John Hungerford Pollen, was a Jesuit Reformation historian. So one may well wonder in whose interest that kind of quasi-ecumenical attempt to celebrate martyrs of all the Reformations might be. And let me just leave you with a very different image, nothing to do with Oxford. These are universities from counter-Reformation Europe. They're either very classical or very Baroque. The Reformation or the Reformations in England and Britain might not have happened. At every point, there was the possibility that the Protestant religion would lose out to the Catholic one, essentially till the end of the 17th century. So if that had happened, some of the buildings in Oxford, which are now predominantly Gothic revivalists, if we think of those erected before the early 20th century, some of them might very well have looked like this. Thank you very much.
Perfect. I think at this moment, to observe the minute's silence, we'll just make our screens dark and we will resume at 1 minute past the hour to discuss Paulina's magnificent paper. After that moment of focus and reflection, may I congratulate Paulina on a most wonderful...
And
Sue too. Now, what I'm going to suggest is we're going to take questions on both of these excellent papers. And what I suggest is we do this using the chat. I will just open it on my computer. And if anyone has a question to direct, maybe they would just let me know which of our speakers they would like principally to direct to. And while you're just gathering your thoughts for that, I actually have a question for both speakers. First of all, for Sue, thanking you so warmly for that comprehensive and fascinating paper that just touched on everything: pamphlets, the reform of the church interior, the text of the Bible. It was magnificent. Sue, I'm just wondering, how was James affected by the fact that his wife was a Roman Catholic, and that, as far as one can tell from the Jesuit records, she had a Jesuit chaplain in Greenwich? What do you think?
I think James used it.
Aha!
In typical James fashion, he used it to hold out hope to Catholics that there was the possibility of a conversion, that there was a possibility even of Prince Henry going to Spain if he had a dynastic marriage. So I think that it was useful to him. And you see, Anna was so discreet. Anna was churched in a Protestant church in England. Her children were baptized in Protestant churches. She was not a Henrietta Maria. And consequently, they worked as a partnership. You know, like we've heard about Prince Philip and Elizabeth. In many ways, those two worked together in those kinds of, in different ways, but worked together in a partnership. As far as Protestants were concerned, it was really covered up. It was not widely known, which is why I put it on my slide. And there was always sort of, the Catholics were making overtures towards Anna rather than Anna was making overtures towards Catholic, and in fact both were happening. So that's my answer, really.
That's wonderful, and I mean, thank you, because that really is most interesting, suggesting this kind of clever collaboration between husband and wife.
And you get it all the time. You know, it's sometimes been said that Anna's masks were attempts to undermine her her husband. And personally, I think that's absolute nonsense.
Nonsense.
Politically, and also, and if you look at the Mass, the way that they celebrate James and the dynasty and his peace process, which Anna is behind, they're working together. And you can see it too, because the Privy Council says after the first Mass, was so expensive, they say, we don't want any more. And James said, if she wants a mask, she's getting a mask. And the truth was that he wanted the masks as well, because it did a great deal for his own reputation and the cosmopolitan nature of the court. And it was a celebration of his own power.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. If I may turn to Paulina and ask a question that's really puzzled and fascinated me as you were talking, and covering such a rich variety of testimonials, traces, memorials in Oxford. I mean, suggesting that one just has to open one's eyes, listen to a paper like yours, and then you see so much more in the streets. Do you think that the changes in the way that things are articulated, in the way that commemoration is made, do you think those changes are to do with change in the Church of England rather than political or any larger change, that the Church of England has become more friendly to Catholic idea and practice in a wider way? Any thoughts?
I think that is certainly part of the story. And interestingly, when Catholics gained emancipation, they were obviously a minority. They felt very vulnerable. They felt that emancipation might be curtailed or revoked. If you remember, that slide actually showed that there might be some constraints there. And at various points, attempts were being made. So they were a beleaguered minority. Now, the Anglican Church is in some ways a beleaguered minority globally. And that is partly reflected in their attitude to Catholics. And secondly, the ascendancy of Anglo-Catholicism is extraordinary. In a very important article, Dermot MacCulloch was calling for reconsideration of how we understand the Reformation. And he, in many ways, was complaining that because of the Anglo-Catholic ascendancy, the true Reformation has been forgotten. And I think he's right. There is a great deal of truth to that. For me, it's when I was looking yesterday, and I hadn't done it before, at the website of St. Mary Magdalene, and what it actually said. Again, Golightly and all those who wanted the Martyrs' Memorial put up must be turning in their graves, seeing that the Martyrs' Memorial is basically past, is not really noticed by many people, except as a place to sit down and have a sandwich, and that people are flocking to St. Mary Magdalene's for very high Anglican ritualistic service.
How fascinating. Now we have a question from Alexandra. Would you just like to appear and unmute and ask it? Alexandra.
Yes. Sorry, I'm really sorry. I've just been in a 3-day conference where we were doing I ask a question rather than putting the question in the chat. So I'm sorry, this is probably the wrong thing, but it really relates to Sue's question. Thank you both for such amazingly rich papers. I'm just really interested in the question Peter brought up about how you, as a convinced Calvinist, produce a kind of political settlement with your wife. So you're saying he uses Anne's Catholicism, but he also keeps it very quiet. I mean, how does that work? What methods does he do to do that? And what does it mean about James's attitude towards religion in general, and his sense of his notion of conscience?
Right. He does it by demanding obedience. And he does it too with people like Henry Howard. You know, he says, you know, if you're to be with me, you're to pray with me. And so what you believe, as far as James is concerned, I think is outside his concern.
So how does he use his wife's Catholicism?
Because he writes
in a public sense.
Oh, he doesn't in England. It's about what he writes to the Pope, what he writes to Spain. Certainly in England, he's not using it. Absolutely not. I mean, I think except in the sense that Anna is sometimes used to work with the Spanish envoys who come over. He's out hunting and is perfectly happy for Anna to operate as his surrogate in that respect. So, I mean, I think you'll ask a very important question, and it fits in also with what he demands in relation to the Puritans, because I didn't have time. I'm afraid it was one of the things I left out because just of time constraint. But he demands that there is conformity to the prayer book and to the canons, and the bishops are demanding subscription, whereas James is demanding conformity. And it's the same thing. So James, you know, I mean, I think, you know, if I were James, which I'm not obviously, and I'm imagining, I think he would say to himself, it's for God to judge conscience. I'm here to judge obedience and behavior and conduct. Does that make sense?
It absolutely makes sense. Thank you so much.
That's wonderful. Now I've got some questions from the chat. First of all, two fascinating questions from Daniel Gifford. First of all, for Sue, when did James's charm wear off for Puritans, and did Puritans try to create trouble as a result? When did James's charm wear off? Did Puritans create trouble?
Yes, James's charm, insofar as anybody thought he was charming, I think for the most part that wasn't a quality that was associated with James. But nevertheless, he certainly lost their confidence in the conscription campaign and the conformity campaign, which is taking place 1604-5. And it's quite clear that James, even more than the bishops, was behind that campaign to demand conformity. I can give lots of examples about that. And when we say that he lost, perhaps they were no longer believing that he would change, even though they continue petitioning, what the petitions start moving towards is less about there will be changes, but rather that there will be leniency, that all these different people are needed in the church. And so even if they're non-conforming, they need they shouldn't they shouldn't be deprived. And so I think this is a shift that happens. Now, for the majority of Puritans, they do accept the royal supremacy. You know, despite they think he's got it wrong, but but there are others, of course, who move into a form of congregationalism and leave England, and they go to the Netherlands, and it's from that group in the Netherlands that you've got your Mayflower group. So I would say pretty early on, actually, the Puritans become disillusioned. James is not anti-Catholic enough, though, you know, how much more could he be during the period of 1606 to 1610? But, and also, of course, it's quite clearly not going to allow their types of demands and improvements as they saw it to take place.
Wonderful, thank you. Now, I have from the same questioner, one for Paulina. Does your research extend into the role of memory of the Reformation in political parties? So does it extend into memory of the Reformation in political parties? And if so, how consistent was religion with political identity in the 18th and 19th centuries? So religion, political identity, 18th, 19th century, the role of religion in political parties.
That's an excellent question, and also calls for a very complex one. I think to the question of party, and religious identity, we also have to add national identity. I alluded to the importance of Ireland in the 1820s, and that it was actually the situation in Ireland that precipitated a lot of the Catholic Emancipation Act. Similarly, the situation in Scotland changed drastically after the huge influx of Catholics from Ireland. Party identity let's just go back a step. Of course, Tories were always high Anglican, and we are talking the earliest emergence of party in the later 17th century. Tories, Anglican, Whigs, much more radical and much more supportive of dissent. And this stays that way. But of course, we have the emergence of liberals, and liberals take a slightly more muted approach. And after 1829, let's also remember, Parliament admits as MPs people from these diverse confessional persuasions. One of the reasons for the emergence of the Tractarian movement was in fact the annoyance and the fear and the outrage that post 1829 you might have a multi-faith parliament legislating for the Church of England. Let's remember that what's quite unique about the English Reformation is that it's Reformation by statute. One of our friends, Norm Jones, published an extremely important book, Faith by Statute, about the Elizabethan Reformation. So this means that forever the fate of the Church of England is bound up with the state.
That's fascinating. Now I've got another question, really I think for you again, Paulina. This is from John Wilson, and it's a question about portrayal of religion in contemporary media. TV series usually portray churchmen as Roman Catholic priests called Father. The fact of Britain still being Protestant seems to have escaped the media. Any thoughts about that?
I think not just the media, but also some of the authors. I am not a fan of Hilary Mantel's novels. And one of the reasons for that, and I better come clean, I am not a Roman Catholic and I'm not a Protestant. I am a nothing. So I'm not trying to peddle my own religious views here. But one of the problems with her work is that it is extremely anti-Catholic, and that in turn translates into the presentation of 16th century conflicts on television and in the theatre. And if you're interested to follow up on this, I completely endorse Eamon Duffy's criticism both of Mantel's novels, but after all, she is a creative writer, so she's able to do what she likes. But there are now popular historians who are following in her wake and who are basically using Mantel's novels as the source of information about the Reformation, which results in a completely distorted view. And so you think of More as this completely nasty figure, and Cromwell as a true hero, and that is simply not true.
Wonderful. Now I've got a
could I just add something here? I just want to add with a story. I was once asked to be a consultant for Shakespeare in Love, you know, the film. And one of the things, it was about the religious elements, and that when they showed me that they were going to have a procession with a big cross in Protestant England, Elizabethan England, I said, you just can't do that. You know, this is not the style of worship or whatever, going to church. and they refuse to listen. And what it is, in part, is that they find Catholic ritual much more colourful and much more as they understand religion. And so, you know, they're not too bothered about doctrinal or liturgical differences.
And actually,
somebody, sorry.
No, I was just going to say, it's not just that, but because many of them will be familiar with the Anglo-Catholic service now.
That's also true. But I think they use the word father because that immediately identifies someone as being a priest, where it's, you know, they just want kind of, as it were, visual signposts. And these are shortcuts. Yeah. So if that helps answer the question.
So I have a number of wonderful questions now. I'll put them quite briskly. Now, question for both. Were the regulations preventing Catholics and others from studying and holding positions at Oxford and Cambridge strictly enforced, or were exceptions made to attract people for various reasons? So that's really quite a brief answer asked. Any thoughts, anybody?
Well, for the most part, there was no relaxation, but what we need to emphasize is that whereas in Oxford, you had to take the oath and subscribe to the 39 articles at matriculation, in Cambridge at graduation, which meant that a lot of Catholics and dissenters could go to Cambridge way earlier and simply not take the degree. And secondly, I mentioned that Catholics were essentially forbidden from studying at Oxford by the Pope and the Catholic hierarchy after 1871. But you could ask for an exemption, and you could confess and ask your priest for permission to send your son to Oxford or Cambridge. So there were always ways around it, but until 1854, you didn't really, you couldn't come and study at Oxford until and unless you took the subscription.
Can I come in on this? There's a distinction also between proceeding to a degree and coming to study. And one of the things I had to cut out of my talk this morning was the extent to which the halls are not as easily policed as the colleges. And one of the really, I talked about lots of Oxford scholars going to exile, but many of them go across the roads to Gloucester Hall, which eventually becomes Worcester, and they end up sort of living sort of informally, but also actually being a kind of community of not Protestants, not exactly Catholic scholars, and existing within the old kind of boundaries of the old university. And someone like John Donne, but also the statutes are very specific about the age at which you have to subscribe. And somebody like Donne comes when he's older. He comes to Hart Hall, but he comes when he is, I think, 13. Is that right, Paulina? You know better than me. But it's definitely before the age at which he's required to take the oath of supremacy and subscribe to the articles of the church. So a sort of ways around things. And I think both, Peter, you must know those sorts of things as well. So there's this very kind of formal policing at the university, but there's a very informal way around things that makes, I think, I can't imagine what late 16th century Oxford would be like in those sorts of senses, but there's lots of people without specifically reformed views who are still able to exist there.
Yeah, I'd like to just add something too, and this is about the 16th and 17th century. We must avoid just thinking in two blocks of Catholics and Protestants. Yeah, exactly. There are a lot of people who, and this terrified the Protestants and infuriated the Catholics, there are a lot of people who would semi-conform, but nevertheless, they would take take the Catholic Mass if they had the opportunity, and would keep Catholic books. And some of those people were definitely in the university in the early 17th century. I think things may have got hardened and the categories got hardened, and that's when you get the sense of the university being a totally Protestant.
I suppose it's
I think we should also remember that by the especially by the second half of the 19th century, really, it's not that everybody wants to come to Oxford. So the various acts make it possible. But in fact, Methodists who are allowed, they are concerned, and they are concerned in a way which is very similar to Catholics, that if Methodists go to study at Oxford, they might lose their faith. So
I've got a couple of fascinating questions, one each, as it were. First for Paulina, to follow up the question I asked. What do you think? How do you think that the progressive canonization of those who died on the English mission, Moore and Fisher, Campion and his companions in the 1970s, and then the second tranche of canonized English martyrs under John Paul II, how do you think that those canonizations affected the commemoration or memory of the Reformation in Oxford?
First of all, I think that not that many people who are not committed Christians would have even noticed those canonizations. But given the growth in the ecumenical movement post-Vatican II, this definitely did have an impact. And you're absolutely right to list those various canonizations, but probably the most important one, and also the latest, was Cardinal Newman's in 2019. And that was celebrated in a way which brought representatives of the Church of England and of the Catholic hierarchy together. But at the same time, let's not forget that a lot of the sort of anti-Catholic sentiment still remains. When Dermot and the Lieutenant of Oxfordshire were preparing to set up the monument to all the martyrs of the Reformation in the church, there were lawyers who objected that it's not possible to put to name as on a plaque someone who is a convicted traitor, as all the Catholics to be listed there had been. Similarly, when I already mentioned the Newman Memorial, something that really interested me very much, which I only learned the other day, is that after the death of Queen Victoria, Edward VII had to read out a declaration against transubstantiation and reviling the cult of the saints and the veneration of the Virgin Mary. This is the beginning of the 20th century. He did it because that's what the law demanded. And then getting that declaration abolished or revised took a lot of years, and it wasn't a very pleasant process. So there are some of the prejudices are still there despite the sort of ecumenical drive.
That's fascinating. Now I've got a wonderful question from Clive Jenkins for Sue. Sue, did James remain Calvinist in core belief, thinking that he was a patron of early Arminians? Lovely question. Over to you.
It's a lovely question. And the truth is, we don't know what James believed. I mean, at one point he said one thing, another point he said something else. At the Hampton Court Conference, he expressed a belief in predestination, which is a Calvinist belief, but it was very much more the looser type, which was a type which said that people had to repent their sins. You know, I mean, he believed that they would inevitably repent their sins, but nevertheless, a form of repentance was necessary when, you know, for salvation, even though that, as I say, would have almost certainly been predetermined. So you're quite right. I mean, really from very early on, I mean, Peter McCulloch has made this very clear that in his household, there were sermons of all beliefs. There was hardline Calvinists, there was Lancelot Andrews, there were, you know, others, Montague. There were, you know, there were people who expressed a great range of theological opinions. And the truth is, James enjoyed theology. He enjoyed talking about it, enjoyed thinking about it. whether the intellect was separated from the core belief or not, I don't know. But what you would get from seeing James operate is an openness, not an openness to Catholicism. There were boundaries that he was not prepared to go beyond, but nevertheless, I think he really was open to listening to and intervening in theological discussions. So the answer to your question is, I don't really know, and I'm not sure that James did.
That's wonderful. Now, I think this is a very good moment, with the clock standing at 28 minutes past, for me to thank you both so much for the most beautifully wide-ranging and really thought-provoking papers, and beautifully illustrated and expanded. And I just would like to say a word or two about this series. So the next event in our Celebrating the Elizabethan College series is on Friday the 28th of May at 12:30 p.m. And our speakers from today's event, Sue and Paulina, will give us a preview of what to expect from a new exhibition which is due to take place at the British Library later this year. It's the title of the exhibition is Elizabeth and Mary, Royal Cousins, Rival Queens. And booking for this event isn't yet open, but an email will be sent out shortly to inform you when it's possible to register. So once more, thank you everybody for attending. Thank you to everybody who's asked such wonderfully trenchant questions. And may I, on behalf of us all, thank Sue and Paulina so much for those fascinating papers. Thank you so much. Thank you.